everybody, and welcome to the Difficult Conversation podcast series with me, Poppy Gerrard-Abbott. Today we are talking about COVID-19 and the rental sector and rental rights. And with me today we have a very special guest, Ashley McLean. She's currently working for the National Union of Students and volunteers with Living Rent Edinburgh, where she does casework, and she will explain a little bit more about what she does in a second. She's also big on feminism and trade unions. She is a self-proclaimed union gal, so very appropriate to be having this conversation with me today. So we're going to be looking at how COVID-19, how the pandemic has impacted renters, and what the current situation means for renters. So welcome, Ashley. Thank you very much for giving up some of your precious time to coming onto my podcast. Hello.
Hello, Poppy. Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat about it all.
Well, if you'd like to tell our listeners a little bit about your incredible campaigning work and a bit more about the general kind of incredible campaigning work that's going on in the Edinburgh and Scottish and UK context, renters' rights, that's a really important campaign effort at the moment during the pandemic.
Yeah, sure. So I got involved with Living Rent Tenants Union back in late December, early January of this year. Basically, I had a couple of issues with an estate agency who I will not name on here. But yeah, I ended up getting involved. And basically, Living Rent exists to give power back to the tenants. I think when you're on your own and you're a tenant and you're perhaps dealing with a difficult landlord or a rent negotiation or an eviction situation, then you can feel really powerless. And Living Rent basically exists to bring that power back to tenants. So as you rightfully said, I do work in terms of doing casework. So that will be if a tenant gets in touch and says, I've got an issue with a landlord, can you help me? We would work with them. But yeah, we do wider campaigning work as well. So before the unfortunate pandemic kicked off, and we were looking at things like campaigning for regulation of short-term holiday lets. And we were also looking at trying to get rent controls in place. Things like that. It's a really, really great organization, like really great camaraderie and just general union love. Yeah.
Well, we're so lucky to have you on the Difficult Conversations podcast series because, I can tell that you're extremely passionate about renters' rights. And just before we get stuck into our conversation, let's just frame the topic a little bit within the kind of picture of COVID-19. So there's a number of reasons why renters' rights and the rental situation is important to talk about when we talk about the virus. Because as an article I recently wrote said, this pandemic acts like a microscope to bring all of the inequalities within our society, whether that's gender, class, racial, the inequalities between homeowners and renters, all of that stuff, every single inequality that exists in the UK and wider global, in our wider global societies are really coming under the microscope during the pandemic. And we can see much more kind of exaggerated versions of the reality of inequalities. And in this context, talking about renters, that includes the precarity that they face, the unequal power dynamics between renters and landlords. Is there anything that jumps to your mind that I think we can see in a much more pronounced way because of this pandemic when it comes to renters?
Yeah, no, definitely. Like spot on, as you said, like the one thing this pandemic has really exposed is just the sheer inequality caused, I think, greatly by austerity, which has been imposed on us since 2010. I think especially in relation to renters, obviously we're seeing a lot of things in the press right now about the disparities between what rights and protections are being put in place for tenants versus landlords. So for example, we've seen that landlords have been offered up to 3 months of a mortgage holiday, but there's currently no legal reason whatsoever that landlords should give tenants any break on their rents, especially when renters are more likely to be in precarious work situations, be on 0 hours contracts, and because generally we're younger, we're more likely to be working in hospitality or be students. So if you're looking at people who are more financially vulnerable during this pandemic, it's renters. And yet so far all we've had is like a couple of letters from the ministers kind of saying, hey guys, do you maybe want to be nice to your tenants? But that's not happening. So by and large is not happening. So yeah, it's been a really interesting and quite sobering experience, kind of watching the inequalities that we've known have existed all along, but really be brought right to the surface in such a manner that I think for the Scottish government especially, like, you cannot ignore the exploitation that renters are facing in Scotland any longer.
Absolutely. And I think another inequality that was exposed as a result of the pandemic was the kind of secondary status that renters have when it comes to policy creation and implementation. So the first thing that the UK government was rushing to the drawing board to figure out in a policy sense was protecting mortgage payers, mortgage owners, and protecting landlords. And then the rental advice and policy came out weeks later. The initial policies that came out were so inadequate as well that then it took lobbying from the likes of Shelter for the policies to be revised. So not only are renters kind of thought about in a kind of secondary afterthought way, but also the policies that are created are very likely to have holes in them and inadequacies and need to go back to the legislative drawing board to be revised, because there's just such a fundamental lack of understanding at the top as to what the realities, what realities renters face. And I think that their policy, the UK government's policy response during this pandemic has been indicative and highly revealing towards the fact that they fundamentally don't value and understand the realities of renters, and that the focus is on economic protection of the wealthiest, which are, mortgage owners and landlords. So I think that not only has the kind of obvious inequalities been highlighted, that renters just generally have a harder time than and are in more precarious and dangerous situations than mortgage owners. But I also think it's revealed a lot about political and economic values. There's just so much to talk about. But I'm going to start off with a question that is a bit more narrowed and we'll build things up. So going back to the Living Rent trade union that you volunteer for and that you are really passionate about, Ashley, can you tell our listeners a little bit about why we should be particularly interested in the housing and rental market context of Edinburgh specifically? What draws you to campaign in this context rather than in other contexts? And who suffers from the way things are in Edinburgh City?
Yeah, no, cool. It's a great question. And I think that anyone who has, gone to university and has started trying to rent their first flat in the private rented sector, any student, young person can tell you that, especially the reason that Edinburgh is so interesting in terms of renting is because it is so astronomically expensive compared to the rest of the country. I think wider than that, though, Edinburgh is a really interesting place to look at housing because it seems to be almost an epicenter of two of the biggest controversial topics we have within housing right now, which would be Airbnb, short-term holiday lets, in terms of the lack of regulation around them in Scotland, and then also wider rent prices. Obviously, one of the biggest discourses surrounding rent is the fact that we now have, generations of young people that are coming into the rented sector and are likely going to be renting until, I don't know exact statistics, but like say their late 30s, early 40s, and that would be quite average. There's been plenty of texts within left-wing politics which refer to young people, millennials, Gen Zs, whatever you want to call it, refer to us as Generation Rent, because one of the biggest defining factors that makes us different from our parents and our grandparents is the fact that we are so unlikely to own homes until much later in our lives. And that leads me on to answering your second question. And I think that especially within the Edinburgh sector, the people who are really harmed, at least from my personal view, the people that are really harmed by Edinburgh rent prices are definitely young people. That's students who are coming into as we've discussed previously, like purpose-built student accommodation that is just astronomically priced. They are more likely to pay higher rents for flats that, because of the style of Edinburgh housing, are more likely to be like infested with mice, or don't have double glazing, things like that. And then if you look at obviously then Airbnbs, I think secondary to young people would be locals generally. Looking at doing a tiny bit of research, but looking at Inside Airbnb, which is a data intake website surrounding Airbnb usage in Edinburgh, there's over 13,000 Airbnbs currently listed in Edinburgh. This is pre-pandemic.
I read that 1 in 4 houses or properties in Edinburgh are now Airbnbs.
I mean, I'm not entirely sure about Edinburgh. I had a wee look for that, actually, try to find out, because that's like another big thing is makes Airbnb so problematic, is there is no like state-backed tracking of short-term holiday lets. Like, you know, this website, it says like over 13,000, but that's entirely up to the people behind this website or whoever is going through, I think, Airbnb's app and just tracking listings. But there's currently no actual like tracking of how big the situation is. And if you go up to the Highlands and Islands, I think it's something like on the Isle of Skye, 1 in 5 properties are holiday lets. So you've got 20% of all the housing on the Isle of Skye that aren't being used for houses, they're being used for tourists. Like, more to the point with this Airbnb site, because I was having a look, so I found it fascinating. But apparently, according to this, which is Inside Airbnb, the average price of a night in an Airbnb is £133 in Edinburgh. So when you think about, you know, like, obviously we'll get more into this, but if you're looking at the incentive, if a landlord wants to make a ton of money and they're looking at making, you know, a few hundred a month in profits off of actually renting out long term to tenants, versus they can get £133 per night from an Airbnb. Like, it's no surprise that Airbnb has completely boomed and has taken over so many of our houses in Scotland.
I have seen some demonstrations that have taken place that have been organised by Living Rent Edinburgh to lobby the government to impose more controls over over landlords just, you know, choosing to open their houses up as, you know, holiday rentals. It's just completely taken over the city centre. But I find it interesting because how do I balance my critiques of Airbnb with pro-multicultural approaches? Because I want absolutely for people to enjoy the city that I live in, that is so wonderful and so has so much to offer. But I think that tourism just has to be sustainable.
Yeah, no, 100%. Like, one of the biggest challenges, I think, with Living Rent is when we're thinking about, when I've been involved in group discussions, exploring, right, how do we campaign on Airbnbs without coming across as xenophobic? Because I think one of the wonderful things about Edinburgh, and equally one of the hardest things about living in Edinburgh, is the tourism industry there. Like, you know, if you ask any local or student about being a worker in Edinburgh during the Fringe, it's a nightmare. Like, our transport system isn't sustainable. There's roadworks all year, just prepping the city for August to essentially put everything on a standstill for the Fringe, to then basically reset the clock again. And it's absolutely wild. But it's, again, I agree with you. I find it hard because I love the Fringe. Like, I actually performed in the Fringe for a few years when I was in uni. So like, I live for August. But obviously, like, when you're a worker and you're seeing all this money being pumped into tourism, but there's things like, you know, like massive drug problems with heroin usage in Edinburgh, homelessness. Like, when you walk down, I think one of the stark reality checks you get with the housing crisis in Edinburgh is if you're in Edinburgh during the Fringe and you're seeing all this wealth and all this, you know, wonderful love and creativity of the arts being shown throughout the entire city. But then if you walk down Princes Street in the evening and every single shop door has at least 2 or 3 people sleeping in it because they don't have any place else to go. And it's this really kind of horrible juxtaposition of really loving and living for tourism in Edinburgh, but at the same time you're kind of like, you know, if all these houses are being used for Airbnbs to profit off of tourism and to encourage more tourists into the city, but then we have hundreds of our own, like our locals that are sleeping on the streets because housing is just so damn expensive. And it really is such a hard, it's just such a hard situation to swallow.
That visual contrast of poverty, sometimes extreme poverty, and then affluent, luxurious living, I think is one of the really kind of distinct and shocking aspects to living and just walking around Edinburgh. And we're really, really seeing the tangible outcomes, aren't we, there, of gentrification and of housing inequality. I remember, so before I lived in Edinburgh, I lived in London, where I was working in the charity sector for a couple of years before I moved up here to do my PhD. And I never thought that I would see anywhere else the kind of contrast I saw in London of, you know, these glass, you know, financial sector buildings and opulent houses, and bang next to it was people who had absolutely nothing to their name, and there's tents literally right by Canary Wharf. But Edinburgh is in some ways even more shocking than London, because Edinburgh is so concentrated as a city. Like, what is the city centre? And so just walking around the city centre, you know, there's these huge, beautiful, historical old buildings that are worth millions of pounds, with people whizzing by in 4x4s, and then right next to that are people who have nothing. And there's the level of homelessness in Edinburgh. I've been speaking to locals about this since I arrived. You know, they've said it's going ever since austerity has really stepped up. Austerity can sometimes often be quite cryptic and snaky and subtle, but that is one of the really stark and obvious manifestations of austerity, is how they've seen the homelessness increase in Edinburgh.
And I think especially, I think it's been really bitter actually when you obviously read all the articles about all these hotels have just opened up all the rooms to homelessness because of the pandemic, and homelessness has disappeared overnight. And you're sitting there with this kind of thought of, we could have solved this problem long ago, but it was more important for the leisure industry, tourism, whatever, to make profits than to open these rooms to vulnerable people. Now, obviously, that's like a bit of a controversial statement there. Like, I know there's more to homelessness than just letting everyone into hotels to keep them safe, but it is that kind of sobering reality of that if the money is just put in the right place, you can solve these issues. And it leaves you sitting there kind of thinking, right, why aren't you fixing this? Where is the benefit to allowing people to remain homeless?
That's why I think the COVID-19 pandemic is so intriguing and difficult to analyse, because on the one hand, it has revealed to us the devastating inequalities that exist in our society, and has provided us with a microscope, a lens to see those inequalities. And on the other hand, it's almost provided us with this space for an imagination, right, of what could be next. You know, in a matter of days, the UK government put together what especially in the context of having a conservative government, what could be considered as actually quite a radical socialist economic programme. So moving on to my questions about COVID and the rental market. COVID-19 has highlighted many inequalities in our global and local societies. What do you think, Ashley, the pandemic has told us about the rental and mortgage markets?
I think so. The way that COVID-19 has kind of exposed the inequalities in the rental market is exactly as we kind of touched on earlier, is that like there is evidently a lot more political respect for owners of houses than there are for renters of houses. We see, especially from doing casework with living rent, I mean, obviously, contextually, nobody ever gets in touch with their tenants union to tell them my landlord's being really selfless and is being lovely and supportive. I just thought I'd let you know. You know, we don't get that. And when we get casework, we're hearing from people who are saying, yep, my boiler's been broken for 3 months. My landlord isn't doing anything about it. I don't have any hot water. Or within the context of the pandemic, we're hearing, I've lost all my job, all my income. I've got nothing. I've got nowhere to go. I can't afford my rent and my landlord's not giving me a rent reduction. Like, that's what we're hearing. And I think it's that bitter pill of the fact that there is nothing legally put in place that tells landlords if your tenant has lost their job, you are bound to give them a rent reduction. There is nothing saying that. So it's up to this subjective, ambiguous, basically you're counting on the goodwill of millions of landlords to just decide to just give people rent reductions, which especially this is like a wider issue about the problems of having a private rented sector in the first place. The private rented sector is there primarily so that landlords can profit off of the tenants. And for many landlords, we now have a position where most, if not all, of their income comes from owning houses. So we have this situation where we've got this massive conflict of interest where landlords, in some cases, need to make money off of tenants in order to live, and tenants have lost their jobs. And I think one of the big kind of scenarios I put to people when we're talking about the disparities between landlords and tenants is, if you're a landlord and you own a property and you can no longer pay the mortgage, but this is in this scenario, it's a second property, you're renting it out to people and you can no longer afford it, you sell that property. That's what you do. Obviously, there's bigger questions around the market and all these things, but you sell that property. If you're a tenant and you cannot pay your rent and you get evicted, you have lost your home. And I think the fact that we're claiming that there needs to be some sort of equal consideration given to landlords and tenants, when if you look at those two extremes of the worst outcomes for those groups of people, that is massively different. One person is losing their ability to make money. The other person is losing their home. But there is more legal protection on the profit than there is on a person's need for a house.
Wow, that's just so shocking to hear. And I can imagine that Living Rent are receiving some unbelievable stories at the moment about the conduct of landlords. I mean, I'm hearing it kind of anecdotally from friends and colleagues and stories from back home, because my hometown in Essex, in England is poorer, much poorer than Edinburgh. So I'm hearing stories through the grapevine there, and obviously on social media, at the ways that landlords are not only continuing their bad practice, but also are completely flouting governmental legislation. I've heard of landlords that are still carrying out evictions and that are not making any COVID-19 related leniency to their tenants.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. It's definitely been the most infuriating thing about this pandemic. We are now, obviously, disclaimer, not all landlords are evil. I do have to say that, because whenever I talk about landlords mistreating tenants, I immediately get stuck with, well, my friend rents out and she's actually very nice. I'm sure she is. But my point is that in Living Rent, what we're dealing with is the very real reality that there is no legal accountability to landlords to not be horrendous and selfish during this pandemic. If a tenant turns around to the landlord and says, right, can I get a rent reduction? I've been furloughed, so I've only got 80% of my pay. Can I get a 20% reduction on my rent? There is no legislation that says to the landlord that they have to do that. Again, there's been letters. I think the housing minister has written a letter saying, can landlords please act with kindness and all that jazz? But that's nothing. That's not going to do anything.
Yeah, absolutely. There are pockets of landlords that follow ethical good practice and that believe that the rental rate should be fair, and they have very good relationships with their tenants. But you're talking about the structural issues, right? It's the same argument that's used, I don't know, when it comes to feminist issues around things like gender-based violence and sexual violence against women. Yeah, of course there are nice men who don't perpetrate, but that doesn't negate from there being this very stark structural arrangement where men are the majority of perpetrators and women are the majority of victim survivors. Of course, there are pockets that are exceptions from this wider structure, but you're interested in changing the economic structure. That's what Living Rent is interested in doing. So that's what it's focused on, right? So absolutely. Thank you for the disclaimer. But I think that I completely see what you're saying there, and I think you picked up on something really interesting in terms of tying together the political value and economic value of certain classes and groups of people, such as landlords and mortgage owners, with their kind of social and cultural value. So one thing that I've spoken about in an article I recently wrote on feminist approaches to COVID is how policing is unevenly applied, and how the way that surveillance is applied and the ways that we will interact with surveillance. And by that, I mean complying with lockdown and COVID policies. That is shaped by class and age and gender. So what we're seeing is the wealthy driving by in 4x4s and almost escaping. Well, they are escaping surveillance from the police, but groups of poor people on the street, they don't have that mobility and that veil, and they're the ones that are largely receiving the fines for breaking the policies. And also in terms of who's shouldering the emotional and cognitive load and stress of COVID-19. And that is largely, poorer classes. And in the context of what we're talking about in this podcast, that is renters over landlords. And their right to rent seems to supersede people's right to have a stress-free life during the pandemic, which I think is quite profound.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think there's just such a huge disparity in the way that we're treating different classes during this pandemic. So we have this situation where, as you said, like policing within different areas, like that's, if we're like looking at very base level criminology, if you look at debates about, right, okay, which crimes are actually, easier to prosecute. So obviously you can monitor surveillance, but can you monitor tax evasion and that kind of thing? And I think linking back into, as you're saying, like the wealthy kind of escaping the true stress of the pandemic compared to renters, if we look at people in social housing who are perhaps living in council estate flats, who don't have access to gardens, who are probably more likely, if they're a family, they're more likely to have children sharing bedrooms, they're less likely to have like a separate study or a dining room. Most of them might actually, many of them may just only have like kitchenettes and things like that. And then we're holding them accountable to social distancing. And then we see obviously the previous Scottish Chief Medical Officer, Catherine Calwood, was it Catherine? Apologies for getting her name wrong. She's actually fantastic apart from that unfortunate blip where she went to her second home. I've seen her speak at the First Minister's Advisory Council on Women and Girls, and she is a fantastic public speaker, and I was really quite gutted when I read that she'd gone to her second home in Fife, and it was just kind of like, oh, you're so much potential. But we see wealthy people who have access to gardens and outdoor spaces, and they're talking about the trauma and the damage on the economy of COVID-19. And then we obviously have people who are in lower socioeconomic backgrounds, more likely to be in social housing, who don't have access to private gardens. They might not even be getting their own space. And we are holding these two groups to the same accountability, the same fines, because we're expecting them to adhere to the same rules within very different circumstances. And yeah, I think what you're saying about policing, I mean, when are you going to be more likely to break social distancing rules? If you are in a tiny council flat with all of your family without any access to an outdoor space, versus if you live in a quite spacious multi-bedroom bungalow with access to a private garden, which group is going to be more likely to break social distancing?
Yeah, I think that what you've touched on there is that there are so many groups of people in society that are neglected and overlooked when it comes to policy creation around COVID, and also just general conversations about COVID. I think we're leaving behind in these conversations people who live on their own. We do not talk enough about isolation and how people I think a lot of the policies, especially working policies, have been addressing people with children and caring responsibilities, which is fantastic. Again, going back to this imaginative aspect to the COVID pandemic, what improvements to working practices and to society and to policy can we make as a result of these inequalities, such as, caregiving inequalities, being exposed. But also there are other groups that are still being left out, isolated people, people who would be living in cramped living conditions. So for example, migrant families or refugee families, or women who are single parents and are living on their own with sometimes quite a few children. There are so many different housing situations that are omitted from the conversation. And as you say, if you have a private garden and private space to exercise and sunbathe and so on, and a private library or whatever, and a spacious kitchen, that is such a fundamentally different living situation and experience of COVID-19 than if you're living in a cramped flat and your landlord hasn't fixed your oven. And I'm interested in how we've created these policies that have applied in like a flat way, and we're imposing them on people in this flat way, but people's housing situations are so fundamentally shaped by their economic status and by the gender order as well. Women are more likely to be single mothers, for example, or women are more likely to have caring responsibilities that would involve elderly relatives living in the home, for example. If you live on your own, that's also more likely, I think, to be you're more likely to be a woman. So there are so many different angles that are getting forgotten about in this conversation. But moving on to my next question, which is perhaps slightly unusual. So if you need to take a second to think about it, that's no problem. I'm interested in what COVID-19 is telling us about the tourism industry and holiday markets. So as we've seen Edinburgh enter the lockdown, we've seen that kind of life has ticked on in many ways without this income from the tourism industry that the Scottish government and UK governments, claim is just kind of so important and so wonderful for local economy. And, I'm interested I'm just maybe rambling a bit here, but I'm interested in how the slowing down or entire closure of these markets temporarily has, allowed locals to perhaps interact with space a bit differently, go into the city centre, how it's allowed kind of nature to flourish a little bit more, how it's challenged the role and the status of companies like Underbelly and Virgin. So I was just wondering if you had anything to say about that, whether you think that this is also maybe a chance for us to reimagine what the tourism industry could look like in Edinburgh, where it's perhaps kind of slowed down and a bit more sustainable and ethical.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really interesting discussion point, especially looking at Edinburgh, and particularly given the fact that the Fringe has been cancelled for the first time, which is absolutely insane. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm actually currently removed from Edinburgh. I'm just outside of St Andrews, staying with my dad just now, because ironically I have access to a private garden here, which I don't in my flat in Edinburgh. But yeah, no, I think that the Fringe has always been quite a contested subject with people in Edinburgh, because as much as many people do enjoy the arts, there is big questions surrounding, who actually benefits from the Fringe Festival? Because we see companies like, as you've labelled, like Underbelly, the Fringe Society, these private theatre, not just theatre, private arts companies that, rank up the prices of the market around you. Like if you look at, for example, I know that, when I was in the Drama Society at university, we would perform at the Fringe every single year, but it was nearly impossible to make a profit. With the Fringe, you think that the Fringe's best benefit goes to the performers, it goes to those who are involved in the arts. But if you look at the prices of Airbnbs and private rented flats, the prices all get shot up in August deliberately, because they know they're getting this influx of primarily young, primarily students, primarily middle class young people that are coming in to perform in the Fringe, to experience the Fringe, to experience the nightlife. So they shoot up the prices because they know they can get away with it, because, I mean, as we've kind of touched on, there's no regulation regarding rent prices. There's nothing telling landlords you can't charge this much. So then what we have is also related to renting actual theatre spaces. And I know for a fact, obviously won't name the company, but we rented out, when I was in the Drama Society, we would rent out a slot 1 hour between 6:30 and 7:30, 1 hour a day for a 2-week run, and it cost well over £2,000. And that was for a 1 hour slot with 5 minutes set up, 5 minutes get out. Like, it is nearly impossible to make a profit from the Fringe. So you've got to be asking, what is the point of the Fringe? What is the point of this concentrated tourism hub in Edinburgh? Because all this money is going to these private theatre companies. Is it actually getting reinvested back into the Edinburgh economy? It's doing, wonders for the hospitality industry in Edinburgh, like, you know, from having part-time jobs during the Fringe as well, working in bars and things like that during the Fringe. Trust me, the bars are making a lot of money during the Fringe. But you've got to be asking, like, what about locals? What about homelessness? What about schools? What about even, you know, the very British subject of what about the potholes? Like, is the money from the Fringe helping to fill in the potholes? Like, those kind of anecdotal wonderings, because I think it is really, really hard to kind of, especially when we've got a very big lack of awareness over, right, how much money from the Fringe is actually being reinvested into the city infrastructure. And one of the things that we've asked as living rent is that Airbnbs should be taxed. If I'm aware, what we're asking for is Airbnbs to be taxed in such a manner that all the money that comes from the taxation of Airbnb should actually be reinvested into housing, not into tourism. Because we currently have a housing crisis. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. We have a housing crisis when it comes to private rental sectors, when it comes to homelessness in Edinburgh. As we've touched on, you walk down the street on Princes Street and you just see every single shop doorway has a homeless person in it. And you've just got to wonder, right, okay, the Fringe is this massive, wonderful, sorry, I'm trying to think of the words, affluent, if the Fringe is this massive, wonderful, affluent event that brings in rakes of cash into the Edinburgh economy, then why are we still struggling? Why do we still have such a massive extent of homelessness in Edinburgh? Why are people still struggling to pay rent? And why are we now, in the middle of a pandemic, in one of the wealthiest cities in Edinburgh, do we still have landlords refusing rent reductions for apparently, like, for what we can tell, no good reasons? It's just a massive, that was a bit of a ramble, but yes.
It was a perfect ramble.
Thank you.
Wow, there's just so much to unpack there. I think I could do, and I've even thought about this, I could do a whole nother podcast on the Fringe, because what is so interesting about the Edinburgh Fringe is, as I was kind of, you know, going back to this microscope that I've spoken about a few times, the Fringe is almost one of these case studies where if we study it, we can get a very concentrated understanding of how the inequalities exist and operate within the context of the city that the Edinburgh Fringe is hosted in. So, you know, the Edinburgh Fringe touches on absolutely everything, doesn't it? It touches on housing. It touches on business. It touches on disability. It touches on the commercialization of the arts. It touches on corporatization, neoliberalization, capitalization. Even I've had some really interesting discussions that have kind of snowballed out of discussions on the Fringe around Scottish independence, because and I know that's maybe a little bit of an elephant in the room with this whole this conversation we're having today. Or some people may not even kind of make these connections, but I've heard some people pose the questions: how can we trust the Scottish National Party, the SNP, to take the lead when it comes to Scottish independence if this is their approach to housing and business and income for Scotland? And I'm not, putting that in the podcast with any particular biases. I'm fascinated by the Scottish independence discussion. I don't have any particular opinion, and maybe I don't even have, lots of people would argue that I don't even maybe have a right to weigh in or vote because I'm English and I've only been here for a couple of years. But I'd be very interested, moving on to our next question, to hear your perspectives of what do you think of the UK and Scottish government's responses to COVID-19, particularly in relation to their provisions for renters and in relation to housing, and if there's anything that you'd like to add around the SNP in particular, please do dive in.
Yeah, sure. No, I think for me, at a very base level, one of the most interesting things about this pandemic in the context of Scotland is been this whole, almost like what has been viewed for some people as this revigoration of the union. I was, at least back in 2014, I was a yes voter, so I voted for independence. And I think in principle, I would still be for independence, but I think I've definitely become a lot more on the fence as I've kind of gone through uni and kind of spoken to different people. I'm still very much undecided about it, but in principle, I would support independence, but obviously we need more facts and evidence anyway. But yeah, no, I think it's been very interesting reading on social media and the press, the way that Nicola Sturgeon has had very different responses to Boris Johnson, I think, and I don't know whether that's related to gender, whether it's related to obviously how we perceive the Scottish government, because I think there's still, especially in the context of a pandemic, we've had this very odd power handling situation where the UK government seems to be giving the primary lead on guidance as to how to deal with the pandemic, whether that be obviously announcing the schemes for, the self-employed, for the furlough scheme for employers, and the mortgage holidays itself. And but obviously Scotland has certain powers that are devolved. So there's currently today, I think the Welsh government and the Scottish government have stated that they will decide when the schools reopen. So I think it will be very interesting, particularly in the context of exit plans, to see how the public responds to what is potentially going to be very different outcomes for Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland compared to England because of this devolution. So whether that means that, like, for example, if England announces, right, schools are going back next week, but then the Scottish government says, no, right, we're not going back to school until August, is going to be extremely interesting to see how public discourse responds to that and how much. I think Nicola Sturgeon must be in such an interesting situation right now, because from the sounds of what she's been saying in the press, and I follow her on Twitter and things like that, she's seeming to be much more pessimistic about exiting lockdown compared to Boris Johnson. And I think it will be quite interesting to see how attitudes towards Scottish independence change depending on how the Scottish government, and particularly the SNP, choose to respond to the UK's overall exit strategy. I think it will be very, very interesting to see how that develops as the months go on.
I think that's such an intriguing point in terms of Nicola Sturgeon's response to the pandemic policies. I have seen a few articles around the differences between male and female leaders around the world and their responses to COVID. And the countries that are led by women have lower death tolls and a number of other kind of distinct features to them, to the ways that they've responded to policies. Certain areas of policy have been prioritized before profit. I think that that's a very, very interesting point that relates to feminism and international relations. Like, are women leaders? Are the qualities of women leaders really shining through during this pandemic when we're kind of contrasting the likes of, the Prime Minister of like New Zealand and Nicola Sturgeon to that of like Trump's and so on. So, it's really interesting. And thank you for sharing some information about, your personal political persuasion when it comes to Scottish independence. I know it's a really fiery topic. But I'm really interested in how, again, because the pandemic is exposing just absolutely everything at the moment, how it's also exposing perhaps differences and between Scotland and England, but also revealing the strengths and the interconnections of the union.
Definitely.
Is there anything, just before we move on to our final question, that you think is like distinctly Scottish that has come out in terms of the Scottish government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic?
I don't know. I think it's just been more the Scottish public as a response. Like, I mean, obviously I know this is like sweeping generalizations, but generally I've seen less situations of people breaching social distancing measures in Scotland than I have seen in England and the likes of London. Like, obviously, I mean, I've been removed out of Edinburgh for a while now, so I'm in just outside of St Andrews, which is obviously, because all the students have gone home, it's like pretty much a ghost town. But from what I've seen in the press, there's been very few instances of like massive gatherings at like the Meadows or Kelvingrove Park in Glasgow. Versus what we're seeing in London and things like that, where we've got like protesters arguing that it's like a 5G conspiracy theory. And that's just very basic. That could just be down to the fact there's more people in London than there is in the entire of Scotland. So there's probably an increased likelihood of finding people who are conspiracy theorists with this, with the pandemic. But I think generally, I mean, from what I've seen on social media and like following press and things like that, and obviously being very aware of the fact that social media is unfortunately very good at just showing people the articles that they would want to read. I've generally seen more articles saying that there's more trust in that Scots have for the Scottish government than what would appear to be for the UK government. But again, I don't know how able I would be to say that as being an unbiased statement for the very what I just said before, the fact that my social media, because I'm quite like, I'm a big fan of devolution, obviously said probably more aligned with independence than not. However, so therefore my social media timeline is going to be more likely to be articles that agree with my point of view. But
that could be another podcast in itself, couldn't it? Like elections and politics and algorithms and bots on social media and data harvesting. Oh my God, it's so fascinating and scary, and how our Twitters and Facebook feeds can become these, you know, these cages and echo chambers reflecting our own and reinforcing our own perspectives and arguments. So that's why it's been great to be to run a podcast, to be honest, during the pandemic, bringing together different perspectives in a time that's really isolated, and where our lives previous to the pandemic were already really dominated by social media. And now it's like even more so, like our whole lives have moved online. So having this podcast to facilitate some dialogue on all of the political issues surrounding the pandemic, because something that I keep reinforcing is that the pandemic is only kind of slightly a health crisis. It's more fundamentally a political and economic and gendered and social crisis. It's a crisis of capitalism. It's a crisis of housing. It's a crisis of policy. It's a crisis of inequality. So it's just been great having you on the podcast today to talk about the housing angle of this all. So to finish up, I'd like to ask you, what is the dream for both the Living Rent Edinburgh Union and also you personally when it comes to your campaigning efforts? Do you think that there is an alternative future for housing? Do you think this pandemic will trigger an alternative world, or are you feeling pessimistic that basically everybody's hungry to get back to normal capitalist order, and that when this pandemic slows or stops, I'm not really sure what word to use, but you know, we will go back to business as usual? I keep kind of moving in between both perspectives. I see these like glimmers of hope, and I'm like, wow, this is, you know, the homeless are off the streets, and you know, workplaces are realizing that like women do tons of unpaid reproductive and caring labor. Oh my God, they're realizing this for the first time. But is it just going to kind of go back to normal once the pandemic is over? Because, you know, even during the pandemic, we're seeing that landlords are getting their way and are doing everything in their power to ensure that business as usual and continuity occurs. So, yeah. To finish up, what's your answer to that? What is the dream, Ashley?
I think since you obviously got that kind of the preamble sheet before coming on today, and I saw that question at the end, and it got me really thinking about what is the dream for the housing sector. I think the issue is that the people, as when we're talking more widely about like getting back to, you know, the capitalist way of doing things, just kind of business as usual, is that the people who are currently in power, who are deciding our policy, are the people who benefit from those capitalist structures. They are the CEOs, they are the landlords, they are the ones with the mortgages. You know, I doubt there's many MPs or MSPs that are kicking about renting a cramped 4-bed flat in Gorgie and Dalry in Edinburgh. Like, you know, these people own houses. Most of them don't even actually live in their constituencies half the time, which is just mind-boggling. But like, you know, it's one of those things, like, if the people in charge benefit from capitalism, it doesn't matter how much we expose them to the problems of these inequalities with renter and landlord disparities and things like that. It's always going to come back to, no, we want things to stay the way that it is. We think that this works because for them, it works for them. And I think especially as you've said that the pandemic is I think you're right, very much. I wonder if it's even like a secondary health crisis, but primarily it's an economic crisis. And by that, I mean is that we are seeing these almost attitudes from, I mean, this is my very pessimist, almost like anti-government side coming through, but we're seeing people almost being blamed for renting. We are seeing people almost being blamed for being in the hospitality industry, because we're seeing that, all right, okay, well, you can't afford your rent because you work in this kind of a job. Well, that sounds like a you problem. And just lack of empathy. Like, there is still this really horrible stigma of people choose to be working class, people choose to be poor, people choose to rent. And I think that that's fundamentally one of the biggest issues that we have within politics in Britain, is that we have the majority of MPs and MSPs will very unlikely be people that have been reliant on benefits, that have come from poor families. I mean, obviously linking into wider issues, like, you know, like we've seen the treatment of Diane Abbott, who's was the first BME MP, I think. I don't know if I'm totally sure. Jump in and correct me if I'm wrong there. But, you know, seeing the way that she was treated by the Labour Party in those exposed reports, and it's just trundling along. Yeah, so I guess if we're looking at, I think the thing is we have dreams that are both tangible and then ones that aren't. So I think tangibly, the dream would be, right, we need to enforce rent controls. We need to make sure that we have stricter rules on what landlords can and cannot charge tenants for what they're living in. When it comes to Airbnbs, there needs to actually be just point blank, just be regulation. We need to know how many there are, and we need to know the people that are renting out Airbnbs. Like, we've seen an article that's done the rounds on social media that this poor landlord had 22 Airbnbs and now he can't fill any of them. Like, who has the need for 22 Airbnbs? Like, one or two of them I could maybe understand, but like 22 is just unfathomable. So like, in terms of like short-term dreams for the housing sector, you're looking at that. But I think looking at a very probably unlikely and untangible solution for housing is that it needs to be, in my mind, there shouldn't be any need for a private rented sector, point blank. Because as soon as you have the ability to privatize something like housing, you're basically making way for capitalism in order to profit off of a human need. I think I'm reading a book right now by an author called Danny Dorling, and it's called All That Is Solid. And one of the first paragraphs he writes, which I think is fantastic and just kind of sums it up, is, if people hoarded food because its value was bound to go up when others starved, we would stop them. But that's what's happening with housing in Britain. People who have the money are buying housing in bulk because they know that other people can't afford it and therefore need to rent, and therefore they can charge as much as they want in rent to make as much profit, so then they can buy other houses. We literally have a situation where the wealthy are hoarding houses and renting it out to poor people, who are then staying poor because rent is taking up so much of the little income they have, they can't save up and get deposits. So in reality, if we want to solve this, what is massively a capitalist issue, is we need to basically find a way to stop having a need for a private sector around housing. Housing is a human right, it's a human need. And the fact that people are able to profit from it and are now currently profiting from it, and even in a pandemic, are still choosing profit off of instead of helping people survive. Like, yeah, that's pretty much just the issue. Like, we need to basically overhaul that sector. It shouldn't exist because it just leaves too much room for exploitation.
I think you've illustrated so powerfully how we've got the ethics all wrong in terms of the structures of the rental and housing markets. And I also think that that this pandemic has highlighted the many ways that wealthy groups of people hoard resources, not just housing. So, thank you. That's a really thoughtful and reflective note for us to end on there. And I'm also really interested in what you've just said about how the kind of power dynamics between landlords and tenants are set up in the first place. So they have the power to hoard the resources, which then creates a supply and demand relationship between tenants and landlords. So that means that they are entirely beholden to people that actually kind of have no authority to kind of determine the lives of tenants. And what I'm just finding so depressing at the moment is these stories about poor tenants, particularly migrants and refugees and asylum seekers, who are not only dealing with the stresses of being disproportionately susceptible to COVID, but they've also got this additional tremendous stress about literally keeping four walls around them. I just think that it's just such a devastating reality that, you know, not only are you worried about COVID and also potentially worried about what that would mean for your situation? I mean, there's so many worries, the cognitive load of that, worried about whether your job, you're going to keep your job, worried about if you're going to have to move a relative in because they're sick, where they're going to go in your cramped housing, worried about whether you're then going to pay the rent and then lose your home, on top of worrying about this sickness. That's why I do think it's warranted what you said earlier, that, you know, to really highlight and hammer home the realities of landlord behaviour, because landlords are on a significant scale overlooking people's welfare. They're not concentrating on what this sickness is doing to people and their incomes and their families. They're just focusing on making sure there's rent continuity.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, like, in the short term, in relation to the pandemic, I think the next thing the Scottish Government need to do as an absolute is they need to make some sort of legal incentive that landlords should and must give rent holidays to renters who cannot afford to pay their rent. Looking at things like, if people have been furloughed, so they're only getting 80% of their income, they should only be paying like 80% of the rent. It's not difficult to do. And especially because when it's in the private rented sector, landlords have so much control over how much they choose to charge for the rooms that they're renting out. There is no argument to not do it. And especially if you're in a situation where your entire income is coming from property, why is your entire income coming from property?
I think what you've highlighted is how economic inequalities act like a spiral and are all interconnected with each other. So, for example, the poorest groups of people and women and migrants are most likely to be in precarious jobs. Therefore, they are the most likely to be laid off as a result of COVID. They're also the most likely to be renters, and then they're most likely to experience the double whammy of that economic inequality. What I actually saw this morning, the Women's Budget Group released a video that shows you how all of the economic inequalities that women experience are as a result of their unpaid caring work. So that's like the nucleus of it, or the genesis of it. And it takes you step by step through how that spirals upwards, and housing is a huge part of that. So I think it's important to also remember that housing is intersected with all of these other economic inequalities. And just to final thing, just to pick up on something you just said about how you said, and I'd almost like to make this like the title of the podcast or something. You said we can do this differently. There is an alternative, and the rhetoric of austerity tells us that it likes to have this kind of veneer of common sense policies. Like the Conservative Party branding is very much, this is the only way the economy can run. We are the trusted bookkeepers. We are the trusted budget holders. All of the other parties are irresponsible when it comes to, and risk takers when it comes to economy. We know best. We are the people with common sense, and austerity is common sense. It must be done. And what I think the COVID-19 policy response around housing and many other areas, probably the largest would be housing and social welfare, has shown us is, no, we can actually do this. We can have an alternative future.
I think it was definitely very interesting on the back of, obviously, what was quite a shocking general election result, at least especially if you're of left-wing politics in Scotland. And we see that one of the biggest critiques from the Conservative Party towards Labour was, that's an awful lot of money you're spending there. Can't spend that much money. That's not going to happen. And then here we are. And we're spending a lot of money, rightfully, because we need to be spending money. But I think it's quite terrifying to wonder about, right, okay, we've spent all this money, where's it going to come from? Like, we already have a party that was already running the country on austerity, of cuts to funding. The NHS was on the people have been talking about the privatisation of the NHS for years now. And we're now at this, what feels like a bit of a turning point. Like we're a bit of this knife edge, and I think there's a lot of like political tension around this, is that on one hand we have this, what has been a really wonderful kind of camaraderie of people kind of saying, right, let's help the homeless, get them off the streets, let's clap for the NHS workers, let's like, oh, there's, like Captain Tom doing his like 100 laps, and regard taking the controversy out of that, that was very cute. But my point is like we have this whole, we need to rally together for healthcare. We need to rally together for the homeless. We need to, come together. People are protesting about landlord and tenant disparities. But on the other hand, we are at this point where already we've had comments from the government kind of saying of this money had to come from somewhere. And so it's almost this blank wall of, we've had 10 years of austerity, and that was supposed to save us money. And now because of the pandemic, we've had to spend a whole chunk of it again. Where is it going to come from? How are we going to survive? What are we going to lose?
That is an extremely thoughtful note for us to finish on. So listeners, muse over those questions. Thank you so much, Ashley. Is there anything that you would like to say before we finish up?
Just a final thing. Like, thank you so much, Poppy, for having me on. It was great. Really liked it. I'm going to be overthinking my answers for days now, but it'll be fine. But also just to anyone, like, obviously I'm a proper union gal, and I would always recommend, especially in a situation of a pandemic, we don't know how this is going to go. We don't know how we're going to be impacted. I think everyone is in the same boat of just taking every day as it comes. But I think there's power in numbers, and especially if you are a tenant and you're in a situation where you're renting from a landlord and you're a bit worried about work, or your flatmate's worried about work and income, join Living Rent, the tenants union. Even if you don't want to join Living Rent, join your trade union. There's power in numbers, and it's through working together and fighting together that we protect each other and we look out for each other. So yeah, that'd be livingrent.org/rent. I will tell it to Poppy. I will get Poppy to post it.
Yes, absolutely, listeners. We will put all of the relevant links below this video to join Living Rent, and also to find your local union in terms of wherever you work. There's like these, do you know what I'm talking about, Ashley? There are like these search engines where you can find, because obviously not everybody will be with like UCU or Unison or whatever. Exactly, so we will link in a search engine so that you can find your most appropriate and local union. So yeah, absolutely. This is a call to action, comrades and sisters. You have to join your local union, and there are like student memberships available, and I think all of them are income based in terms of what you pay. So there will be a rate that is appropriate to your employment status, and as you say, there is power in numbers, and I can't think of literally a better time to be joining a union, because I think that the government are currently prepping us for a serious period of austerity after COVID-19 settles. So I just think this is the time to be joining a union, or to look into it if you haven't done before. So thank you so much, Ashley, for joining us today. So this has been Poppy Gerrard-Abbott and Ashley McLean from Living Rent Edinburgh, discussing COVID-19 and the rental sector. Thank you so much for listening, and please do tune in to my future podcasts. I've got one on NHS workers coming up, and also on death and grief during the pandemic with some death positivist activists. I've never heard of death positivity, but I'm so excited to learn more. So thank you so much, listeners, and to Ashley, our special guest.
Thank you so much.